The atmosphere in the studio was charged the moment Senator Cory Booker and former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi sat across from each other during a nationally televised panel discussion meant to dissect the increasing political polarization in America, and though the format was billed as a thoughtful exchange of perspectives, it became apparent within moments that this encounter would be anything but typical. Cory Booker, known for his passionate speeches and progressive ideals, opened with a characteristic flourish, denouncing what he called the weaponization of justice by partisans masquerading as patriots, indirectly referencing figures on the right and drawing polite applause from the audience. Pam Bondi, dressed sharply and maintaining an unreadable expression, waited her turn, letting Booker's words hang in the air. But before she could reply, Booker, smiling with that familiar mix of charm and challenge, added with a smirk, "And let's not pretend people who've spent years defending corruption are suddenly guardians of integrity." The camera zoomed in on Bondi's face just as her lips twitched upward into a cold smile, signaling that she wasn't about to let that pass. Instead of responding immediately, Bondi cocked her head slightly and asked Booker to clarify, which gave him the chance to double down. "I'm just saying," he continued, leaning forward with performative calm, "some people seem very concerned with law and order until the law points in their direction. Then it's a witch hunt." The dig was obvious, referencing her past defense of certain high-profile figures during impeachment trials. The studio audience murmured, and Bondi, letting the silence stretch, finally spoke in a tone that was cool, composed, and calculated. "Well, Cory," she said, "since we're talking about double standards, maybe we should look at all the ways your own party bends principles depending on who's in power." The tension deepened. Booker blinked, slightly caught off guard by the sharpness of her retort, but nodded for her to continue, still clearly feeling in control. "Because if there's one thing I've learned," Bondi said, "it's that moral high ground means nothing if you're standing on quicksand." Booker let out a small chuckle, perhaps trying to brush it off, but Bondi wasn't finished. With methodical precision, she began recounting recent instances where politicians on the left had evaded accountability under the guise of ideology, citing selective outrage, prosecutorial inaction, and media complicity. She listed cases and quoted headlines, her voice steady and unemotional, and as she went on, the smug grin on Booker's face began to fade, not because he was defeated by her facts, but because the rhythm of her argument was unrelenting and impossible to interrupt. She turned the lens back on him, highlighting his own inconsistencies, moments when he'd advocated for bipartisanship only to turn around and vilify half the country during election cycles. "You're eloquent," she said, "no one doubts that. But eloquence without consistency is just performance." That stung. The crowd, sensing a shift, fell quieter. Booker attempted a rebuttal, leaning on themes of justice, civil rights, and democratic values, but his tone, which once commanded the room, now seemed slightly defensive. He accused Bondi of false equivalency, of ignoring the dangers posed by authoritarian tendencies in certain corners of the political right. "This isn't about balance," he said. "It's about standing against real threats to our democracy." But Bondi calmly responded, "And who decides which threats count? You. CNN. Twitter." She pointed out the selective outrage culture that had weaponized morality in politics, making enemies not through ideas but through accusation. "We've turned disagreement into heresy," she said, "and the result is not democracy, it's theater." Booker paused, clearly unsettled, perhaps not by the content of her argument, but by how effectively she was delivering it. The moment of stunned silence that followed wasn't just on his part, it rippled through the panel and the studio audience, many of whom were visibly impressed, or at least surprised, by Bondi's poise. The moderator tried to interject, but Bondi pushed forward, calling out what she saw as the left's dominance in cultural institutions, describing it not as progress but as a silencing mechanism. She referenced how dissenting voices were not merely debated but demonized, how unity had come to mean conformity, and how Booker, despite his well-meaning rhetoric, often participated in that very narrowing of discourse. "You don't want dialogue," she said softly. "You want a monologue with applause." The line drew audible gasps and a smattering of applause, not partisan but appreciative of its rhetorical punch. Booker, now blinking rapidly, opened his mouth to respond, but for a few long seconds, he said nothing. It was clear he had not anticipated such a forceful counterattack, and the camera caught the moment his jaw set, his eyes darting briefly toward the audience. When he finally spoke, it was measured, but lacked the sharpness of earlier. He tried to reframe the conversation back toward values, equality, and shared humanity, but the narrative had already shifted. Bondi had successfully turned his mockery back onto him, not through personal insult, but by flipping the frame, showing that the sanctimony often attributed to her side was alive and well on his, too. The more he spoke, the more it felt like he was regaining footing, but not the advantage. In the final minutes of the broadcast, the moderator offered both guests a closing statement. Booker used his time to refocus on unity, warning of the dangers of false balance and the importance of moral clarity. His words were moving, as always, but they now carried an undertone of recovery. Bondi, when given the mic, simply said, "We don't have to agree. But if we can't admit when we're inconsistent, we've already lost the argument." She thanked the moderator and turned to Booker with a gracious nod. It was not triumphalist, just resolute. The show closed with polite applause, but the real conversation exploded online minutes later. Clips of the exchange went viral, with viewers on both sides debating who won, and media pundits scrambling to dissect the dynamics. Booker was praised by his base for remaining composed and principled, while others admitted he had been caught off guard. Bondi, meanwhile, was hailed as unexpectedly formidable, especially by critics who had underestimated her based on preconceived narratives. Her line about monologues and applause became a meme, a quote, a banner for those critical of political echo chambers. Within hours, both names trended, with hashtags like #BookerBondiClash, #PamStrikesBack, and #SpeechlessSenator circulating widely. In the days that followed, neither party issued a follow-up statement about the confrontation. Booker continued with scheduled appearances, avoiding the topic, while Bondi gave a brief interview saying, "Debate's not war. But if you mock people for showing up, don't be surprised when they answer back." It was a moment that redefined public expectations, not just of Bondi, but of the unpredictable nature of live political discourse. Viewers were reminded that performance and principle often collide in the political arena, and that confidence alone doesn't guarantee dominance. In the end, the segment was less about political victory and more about narrative control, and Bondi, for that night at least, had taken the reins. In the week following the televised clash, what had started as a fiery segment on live TV evolved into a national conversation, one that outgrew the personalities at its center and tapped directly into the public's deep-seated fatigue with political pageantry. Analysts on both sides of the spectrum dissected every word, every glance, every pause that had occurred between Cory Booker and Pam Bondi. While some media outlets framed the moment as a rare instance of a progressive stalwart being humbled, others insisted it was merely a tactical misfire in an otherwise solid performance. Booker's defenders argued he had shown restraint in the face of provocation, while Bondi's supporters lauded her composure and her refusal to be cornered. But beyond the ideological scorekeeping, the real shift was happening in the public's growing demand for authenticity. Viewers were no longer satisfied with soundbites and spin. They wanted something that felt raw, unscripted, and unfiltered. Social media, of course, fanned the flames. Hashtags gave way to video breakdowns, side-by-side analyses, even reaction videos by influencers with no political background at all who weighed in on who had won the energy war, as one viral post put it. Cory Booker, ever the public servant, leaned into his strength, optimism. In a town hall meeting days later, he addressed the controversy not directly, but through implication, referencing the importance of humility in dialogue and warning against the addiction to performance masquerading as truth. It was a smart move, subtle but strategic, reframing his stumble not as defeat but as a learning moment, which played well with his base and softened some of the sharper critiques from moderates. Yet, despite his efforts to regain narrative control, something about the exchange with Bondi had stuck to him. People now saw a crack in the armor. Not weakness, per se, but a reminder that passion, when unchecked, can open the door to miscalculation. His typical rhetorical flow, once magnetic and uplifting, was being re-examined through a new lens. Was he connecting or simply performing? Pam Bondi, on the other hand, was riding a different wave. Invitations from major news outlets flooded in, most of which she declined, citing a desire not to capitalize on a moment, though insiders suggested it was a deliberate strategy to maintain the mystique. When she did speak publicly again, it was in the form of a short column, published in a centrist online publication, where she wrote about the value of discomfort in debate. "We grow," she wrote, "not by nodding along, but by being challenged in ways that force us to clarify our own convictions." The column went viral for its tone more than its content. It didn't gloat, didn't grandstand, it simply articulated what many had felt watching the exchange: that there is still power in being calm, factual, and quietly unflinching. Political operatives noticed too. Whispers began to circulate about her being tapped for bigger roles in the next election cycle, not just as a surrogate but as a possible candidate. As the dust continued to settle, something interesting happened. Viewers began revisiting the episode not for its political content, but as a cultural moment, emblematic of the country's craving for real conversation. People were tired of pre-packaged narratives. They wanted the uncertainty, the spontaneity, even the tension that comes when two articulate, ideologically opposed figures speak not at each other, but to the heart of the matter. Think pieces emerged, not about Booker or Bondi specifically, but about what it means to be speechless in the political arena. One viral essay titled "The Power of Being Out-Argued" argued that true leadership sometimes requires being caught off guard, listening, and re-evaluating rather than counterpunching reflexively. The moment between Booker and Bondi was not seen as a win-lose exchange anymore. It had become a study in contrast: charisma versus control, fire versus focus, passion versus precision. Meanwhile, producers of the original show where the exchange had occurred were quick to seize the moment. In the next week's episode, the host opened with a monologue about how real debate is back, and teased future guests with similarly opposing viewpoints. Ratings for the show spiked, doubling in some markets, and advertisers jumped to secure placement in the program's next broadcast cycle. But the production team also found themselves under scrutiny. Were they facilitating real discussion, or manufacturing conflict for spectacle? This led to internal debates within media circles about the ethics of framing such dialogues. Still, no one could deny that the Booker-Bondi moment had struck a nerve, one that pulsed far beyond the political bubble. Universities discussed it in communications classes, comedians satirized it, and late-night hosts made entire segments unpacking Bondi's final zinger that left Booker momentarily stunned. In a rare bipartisan media moment, both figures were invited to speak at a civil discourse summit hosted by a major university. Booker accepted quickly, eager to frame the previous incident within a broader appeal for understanding across ideological divides. Bondi, surprisingly, also agreed, though with one condition: the panel would not be scripted, nor would any questions be pre-approved. "If we're doing this," she reportedly told the organizers, "let it be real." When they finally took the stage again, this time with no cameras and no studio lights, the tone was markedly different, more thoughtful, less charged. Both participants seemed aware of the symbolism, two professionals navigating disagreement without devolving into caricature. In one exchange, Booker nodded appreciatively as Bondi made a point about prosecutorial overreach, and in another, Bondi conceded that systemic inequality was not merely a media talking point but a documented, persistent issue. There was no viral moment, no gotcha, but in its own way, it was even more powerful, a quiet evolution born from confrontation. For Booker, the experience proved clarifying. He later told an aide that Bondi had done him a favor by forcing him to get off rhetorical autopilot and back into active listening. His speeches shifted in tone, slightly less soaring but more grounded, and constituents noticed. He remained a progressive firebrand, but with a new edge, a willingness to admit when he didn't have the perfect answer. For Bondi, the moment had rebooted her image entirely. Once seen by many as just another legal mouthpiece for a political machine, she was now considered a formidable independent thinker. Whether this was earned or simply the result of one well-timed confrontation was up for debate, but the perception had changed. In politics, perception is power, and she wielded it carefully. By the end of that election year, both Booker and Bondi had returned to their respective lanes, he on the campaign trail, she on advisory boards and legal panels, but they remained tethered by that singular televised encounter. Occasionally, reporters would ask them about it, and each would offer a diplomatic chuckle. "Pam's tough," Booker would say. "You can't sleep on her. She, in turn, would reply, "Cory's smart. Too smart to underestimate." And in that mutual recognition, some kind of strange, unspoken respect had emerged, not agreement but acknowledgement. And in today's polarized world, that alone was rare enough to be notable. Months passed, and what had once been a flashpoint moment between Cory Booker and Pam Bondi settled into the background of America's ever-churning political memory, but like embers beneath ash, the tension of that televised encounter never fully extinguished. It resurfaced subtly, in interviews, campaign stops, op-eds, each time their names appeared in proximity, like two figures eternally bound by a moment neither could escape nor fully define. The public had long since moved on to newer controversies, but among strategists, scholars, and debate coaches, the exchange was studied with growing reverence, a masterclass in how composure and timing can shift power, even against a more dominant public speaker. The implications extended far beyond the political theater. Communications departments across major universities began using the clip in media literacy courses, not because it was explosive, but because it revealed how power can tilt without shouting, how silence at the right moment can pierce louder than rhetoric. And behind closed doors, Booker's team quietly adjusted his prep strategy for future debates, integrating behavioral analysts and media coaches who specifically focused on non-verbal cues, grounding exercises, and recovery posture in the face of unexpected resistance. Pam Bondi, meanwhile, emerged not just as a sharper commentator but as a candidate in waiting, courted by donors and policy groups impressed with her sudden, and surprisingly bipartisan, respectability. She began speaking at think tanks, law conferences, and veterans foundations, always avoiding partisanship when possible, striking a balance between tough and temperate, knowing full well that her rise wasn't built on being the loudest in the room, but the one who knew exactly when to land a sentence that made the room pause. Booker, ever the strategist, understood the long game better than most and never allowed that one exchange to define his political identity, but it had subtly altered his cadence, his tactics, his internal calculus. He was now more patient in interviews, more deliberate in forums, and when interrupted, he no longer bulldozed through. He listened, recalibrated, then responded with twice the weight. That pause, which Bondi had mastered, had become part of his arsenal. Observers noticed that he no longer sprinted to applause lines. Instead, he waited for substance to earn the applause. His approval ratings ticked upward again, not dramatically, but measurably, proof that growth, even when born of embarrassment, resonates. Meanwhile, Bondi's profile was growing at a pace that even surprised her inner circle. She was invited to be a guest contributor on multiple major networks, and each time, the producers nudged her to recreate the sharp precision of her Booker exchange, but she resisted, opting instead to speak in measured tones, maintaining her mystique. She'd found a strange new balance between firm conservatism and restrained civility, one that didn't apologize for belief but also didn't indulge in culture war theatrics. Her critics still existed, but they had to acknowledge she was no longer easy to dismiss. She wasn't just a partisan voice anymore, she had become a symbol of how preparation and control could triumph over theatrics. By the time they crossed paths again, it was at a national policy summit in Chicago, held behind closed doors with no press allowed. The moment was almost cinematic, two figures who had changed each other's public arcs standing once again in the same room, though this time no cameras rolled, no producers gave countdowns, and no audience waited to erupt in applause or gasps. What followed was not a rematch, but a quiet conversation at the coffee table near the back of the green room. According to an aide who later leaked a vague account to a journalist, the conversation was cordial, intelligent, and unexpectedly friendly, lasting about 20 minutes. They spoke of criminal justice reform, election integrity, and the role of media in polarizing the public, and while they disagreed on much, the exchange was defined by an unspoken mutual recognition that each had earned a new level of public credibility from their previous clash. Booker later referred to her in a town hall as one of the sharpest legal minds I've debated, and Bondi, when asked by a podcast host about Booker's temperament, said, "He's principled. We just disagree on what those principles should mean in action." It was the kind of begrudging mutual admiration that made headlines less explosive but politics a little less bitter. Still, the media couldn't resist the narrative potential, and speculation swirled about whether either would run for higher office. Booker, a sitting senator with presidential ambitions that had cooled but never vanished, remained cautious, though donors still courted him with big money offers and whispered that his next shot could be different, especially with his new gravitas. Bondi, meanwhile, found herself being quietly vetted for a potential cabinet post under a future Republican administration, legal, justice-related, possibly even a surprise VP pick if the climate demanded a woman who could appeal to moderates without enraging the base. Both knew that their clash had been an inflection point, not just in public perception, but in the evolution of their political selves. They had walked away from the encounter changed, not broken, not embittered, but tempered, sharper, more self-aware. And that evolution, quietly acknowledged between them, became its own kind of legacy. Even years later, when books were written and campaigns launched, pundits would still return to that viral moment. It was often referred to not for its drama, but for its unexpected reversal, how the senator known for soaring speeches was outmaneuvered in one breath by a legal strategist who said less but meant more. It was quoted in memoirs, played in slow motion during debate training, and dissected by AI systems learning political patterns. It didn't matter that it wasn't a scandal or a meltdown or a gaffe, it mattered because it was real. And in an era of curated authenticity, that brief flash of unrehearsed humanity, of one person genuinely stunned into silence by another, was more valuable than 10 hours of shouting matches. Bondi knew it, Booker knew it, and the public, even if they didn't remember the names or the details, remembered the feeling, the rare sensation that for a moment, they weren't watching theater, they were watching two real people wrestle with the weight of words in real time.